In the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 29 and 30, we read this. A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." And then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. The Gospel of Mark, followed by Matthew, has Jesus saying in his first and final words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These are the only words that Jesus speaks from the cross in Mark and Matthew's Gospels. Going through a time of intense suffering due to the Jewish war with Rome that resulted in the total destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and much suffering, Mark's church imagined Jesus expressing what they felt: abandonment and forsakenness. In contrast, Luke, who presents Jesus as the faithful servant Isaiah spoke about, has Jesus say in his final words very confidently, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." John's portrayal of Jesus on the cross is more in line with Luke. In John, quite confidently and boldly, he declares, "It is finished." It reminds me of the words attributed to Paul in the pastoral letter where the author says, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course." Will Willimon, former professor in Duke Divinity School and chaplain at Duke University, did a book on clergy burnout some years ago. And he interviewed scores of clergy who had called it quits. One pastor said he found that one of the most debilitating aspects of parish ministry was that it's never finished. There is always one more sermon to be written, one more book to be read, one more hurting person to be visited and counseled. Another ex-pastor said, "God, how I envy house painters. They can see the results of their work. They get done." Willimon confesses that one of the things that he loved most about academic life was commencement. No matter how bad the year had been, no matter how many disappointing students he taught, or no matter how many lousy lectures he had delivered, there was always that day in May when it was over. Can we say that Jesus had finished all that God had for him to do? For Christians who tend to skip over Jesus' life in order to get to his death because they see salvation completely wrapped up in his death rather than his life, Jesus' claim, "It is finished," makes perfect sense to them. And for these Christians, Jesus' death was a payment to God in order to remit the penalty for sin. They see God's forgiveness solely based on Jesus' death. As one preacher said, Jesus was born to die. So once Jesus died, it was done. It was finished. The work of salvation was accomplished. Of course, you know that I don't believe that. I contend that Jesus was born to live and to show us how to live for God as a living sacrifice, serving others, healing the broken, and liberating the oppressed. Jesus didn't want to die, and I certainly don't believe that he was offering his life in death in order to persuade God to forgive sinners or satisfy God's honor or appease God's wrath or pay off a sin debt or make any other type of cosmic transaction with God. He embodied the grace and truth of God and angered all the wrong people in the process. Later, as his followers began reflecting on his death, they came to see how revealing and redemptive it actually was. All the Gospels were written in retrospect. Their purpose was not to report history, but to proclaim the meaning of the life and death of Jesus as they had come to understand it. The Gospels constitute an interpretation of Jesus, not a mere collection of memories that had been passed down. Looking back, reflecting in retrospect through the theological lens of John's community, they had come to see in Jesus' cruel death at the hands of the powers in control the crowning revelation of God's love for the world. Jesus' life of incarnating and embodying God's love culminated in Jesus showing us just how far God's love will go. Jesus' death on the cross was the consequence of Jesus living a life fully committed to God's will, God's grace and truth. He fulfilled his calling. He finished the course. Can we ever say about our own lives, it is finished? I don't know. But I do believe this. I do believe that if we live in the Spirit, if we live awake, attentive to the grace of God, and if we live in tune the best we can, we all make mistakes, but if we strive to live in tune with the will of God and genuinely seek to embody the love of God in our daily lives, through our relationships and through our service to one another, our service to others through the church and through community organizations, and just in our daily interactions with folks. I think if we do that, we can be content, as difficult as it may be, when the time comes to finally let go of our attachment to this life and anticipate with some hopefulness the great mystery that is before us. I will conclude with a story that Fred Craddock tells, and I won't attempt to just retell it. I want to read it as he tells it. Fred says, a colleague of mine down at Phillips University, a young woman, taught physical education. She was a marvelous person, young, vigorous, unmarried. One night she was sitting in her apartment grading papers, and she heard a knock at the door. She went to the door, unlocked it, opened it, and there stood Death, with his yellow face staring right at her. She slammed the door, locked it, called the doctor. He said, "Malignant." She had surgery. A few months later, she was back, and I said, "Hey, you're looking good." She said, "I never felt better." And now she had lost some weight, but she was back teaching physical education, bouncing on trampolines and all, doing great. Everything seemed to be wonderful. She was at home one night watching television when she heard a knock at the door. She went to the door, opened it, and there he stood with his yellow face. She slammed it and locked it and called the doctor. He said, "Chemotherapy." Oh, she was sick. All her hair came out, so she got a wig and she came back to school. I said, "That's becoming. You should have been wearing that all along." She said, "I feel pretty good." And she was teaching again. One night she was sitting there grading papers in her room, and she heard a knock. So she went to the door, unlocked it, and there he stood, Old Death, with his yellow face. She slammed the door and tried to lock it, but the lock was broken. She called her friends and relatives. Everybody gathered, and we took turns leaning against that door. We leaned against the door. We leaned against the door. We even got to where we were joking and laughing. We're not going to let him in. We'll keep him out. We'd look out the window, and there he sat under a tree with his yellow face right out there. One night she said, "Get away from the door." What? Get away from the door. So we got away from the door, and he came in. I felt sorry for him. He likes to come in with his fiery darts of pain and fear. And there he stood. In one hand he had peace, and in the other rest. He looked like a servant of God. Oh, I know there are people who say, "Well, it's too bad you lost your friend." And it's true. But I heard the whisper in there as we gathered at the church a couple of days later, and the congregation stood in great throng and sang, "Now thank we all our God." It was a shouted whisper. It is finished. Amen.